2, 1.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute, the home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute in the nation's capital. This is the 40th anniversary of President Reagan's inaugural year, and we are marking key moments from 1981 during our year-long 40 at 40 celebration. Next week, we'll mark President Reagan's first foreign trip. On March 10th, 1981, he traveled north of the border to meet with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. Incidentally, last week, President Biden held his first virtual bilateral meeting with, you got it, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, which brings us to our topic of conversation today. No, not the Trudeaus, but more broadly, America's role in the world, from foreign policy to national defense. And to do that, we have three distinguished leaders, three highly regarded public servants, to break down the national security threats confronting a new administration. All three are fixtures at our annual Reagan National Defense Forum. And by the way, our plan is for the Reagan National Defense Forum to be back at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California this December. Secretary Panetta was a Peace Through Strength Award recipient at the 2014 Defense Forum in recognition of his distinguished career as Secretary of Defense, CIA Director, President Clinton's Chief of Staff and OMB Director, and a distinguished career in the Congress. One of his successors, Secretary Mark Esper, is also with us, just months after concluding his service as Defense Secretary. His most important distinction, at least here at the Reagan Institute, is his perfect attendance record at every Reagan National Defense Forum. As of yesterday, he is the John S. McCain Distinguished Fellow at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And rounding out our panel is one of Secretary Esper's colleagues from the previous administration, former National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, whose storied military career in Iraq and Afghanistan is considered unparalleled, and who is now teaching at the Hoover Institution. All three of these men have worn the uniform of our country. In fact, this is an Army-heavy panel, and our mantle, perhaps. All have served with purpose and principle in their many roles, and all possess a keen view, though perhaps not a unanimous view, of the national security threats, challenges, and opportunities we face. But I think they'd all agree on the end goal, to promote American strength as a way to ensure the peace. We'll talk prospects for the next national security strategy, threats to foreign and domestic, and early assessments of the new administration. So ladies and gentlemen, let's dive right into it with Secretary Leon Panetta, Secretary Mark Esper, and General H.R. McMaster. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. We'll start with you first, Secretary Esper, on the role of the military in domestic terrorism. Fortunately, there was no event on March 4th on Capitol Hill, but it looks like the National Guard has been extended for at least another 60 days. And a lot of focus has been on that we currently have more troops in Washington, D.C. than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Two questions for you. One, explain to us the role of the military in addressing the threat of domestic terrorism. And two, in retrospect, did you give this issue enough attention as Secretary of Defense? Secretary Esper.
Well, thanks, Roger. Thanks again for opening another year of a Reagan Foundation meeting such as this. First of all, I think we all agree that what happened on January 6th was terrible. It was horrible. You know, I worked on Capitol Hill for many years, particularly in the Capitol where my office was located. To see those scenes, to see what happened, to see the mob, you know, breaking into the Capitol was just horrific. And those responsible need to be held accountable. Now, with regard to your question, you know, what is the military's role in domestic terrorism? I would say this, and we got to be careful with the words here. I think domestic terrorism is a job best left for law enforcement, whether it's local law enforcement, state, or federal through the FBI. And obviously, when it comes to domestic terrorism, the FBI does have the lead. That said, when it comes to issues of supporting law enforcement, particularly at the state level, there is a role for the National Guard in those cases where you need additional forces, if you will, to ensure that in some cases, like we experienced over last summer, where peaceful demonstrators can express their views, can exercise their freedom of speech and assembly in a way free from violence and personal harm. In the case of the Capitol on January 6th, the Guard was obviously used or could have been used to bolster the police. And so those are different ways, but I always like to view the military when it comes to supporting law enforcement as the last option and not the first.
All right, General McMaster, I want to follow on that with you, but from a slightly different perspective. The White House recently released the National Security Guidance, an interim national security guidance. In it, it identifies domestic terrorism as, quote, a significant threat. The national security strategy, which you wrote in the last administration, did not list domestic terrorism as, quote, a significant threat. It was in there, but it wasn't kind of profiled in the same fashion. Do you agree with the new administration's assessment ranking domestic terrorism as a significant threat?
Well, I think we have to agree that, that the violence we saw on January 6th was abhorrent, and we need to recognize what the causes of it are. And if part of the cause are these groups that believe in these crazy conspiracy theories, and are particularly susceptible to disinformation and really propaganda that aims, I think, to convince them that they don't have a say in how they're governed, that aims to diminish their confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. It preys on elements of our population, this disinformation and propaganda and conspiracy theories, who feel disenfranchised, who feel like they don't really have a say in how they're governed. And so I think that one of the causes of this are real organizations, right? Organizations that radicalize these people and direct them toward violence against innocents for political purpose. Okay, that's the definition of terrorism, and that is a problem, and we have to get at it. I think we also have to get at some of the root causes, which is the information environment itself, Roger, right? The degree to which even our mainstream media, I think our journalists in some measure have compromised their standards in a way that leads to this phenomenon these days, that if you lean one way politically, you watch one cable news station. If you lean the other way politically, you watch one of two others. This is compounded by the pseudo media. It's compounded by social media in particular, whose business model it is to show us more and more extreme information, so they get more and more clicks and more advertising dollars. So we are better connected than ever as a people electronically, but we're more distant from one another than ever, psychologically and emotionally. And so all of us have work to do on this, Roger, and I think that we have to understand that many of these people are people who were left behind by transitions in the global economy in the 90s, and especially after China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And then I think fundamentally that this is an issue of education, right? I really think that civics education and a sense of our history is what's missing among many of these people, and so these are all kinds of approaches you take to defeat a terrorist organization, right? To isolate them from sources of ideological support and so forth. So I do think it's a significant threat, but obviously, as the secretary said, it's going to be carried out much differently here, at home than we do abroad.
So General McMaster thinks that it is a significant threat and is rightly featured in this new national security guidance. Secretary Panetta, I want to, in a moment, jump to extremism within the military. But first, we'd love to get your comments, both in reaction to what General McMaster said in terms of the threat with your CIA director perch, as well as what Secretary Esper said a moment ago in terms of the role of the military. Do you agree with what you heard, or would you modify it in any way?
No, I first of all, let me thank you, Roger, for the invitation to be back at the Reagan Institute. I'd much rather be doing this in person than on Zoom, but these are the times, and I'm glad you're doing this, and I'm glad to be with Mark Esper and HR McMaster in this program. Let me speak first to domestic terrorism. I think HR is right that domestic terrorism does represent a very important threat in our country. 9/11 was a wake-up call for this country. And it was a wake-up call to the threat of foreign terrorism and the fact that they had the capability to attack our country and kill almost 3,000 innocent civilians in that attack. what happened on January 6th is a wake-up call as well. A wake-up call to domestic terrorism. And the fact that there are a group of domestic terrorists who would not hesitate to attack the United States Capitol, bring our democracy to a halt, and basically undermine our system of government. That's a threat to our security. And for that reason, I think it is important to recognize the threat that is represented by domestic terrorism and to do everything necessary to try to confront that. It's not going to be easy. It requires good intelligence. It requires great law enforcement. It requires great judgment on the part of security officials, something we didn't see, frankly, very well on January 6th. I think there were a lot of bad judgments made, a lot of poor intelligence, and the result was that a mob was able to attack the Capitol. I think we have to learn the lessons from January 6th and recognize that there's a lot that needs to be done to improve our approach to terrorism. With regards to the role of the military, I think Mark Esper is correct that the role of the military really should focus on protecting our national security abroad. That's what the military is all about. It's about learning and training the members of our armed forces to fight enemies abroad, not to fight our people here at home. And for that reason, I'm very hesitant to have the military play any role in terms of law enforcement in this country. Now, obviously, you do need oftentimes to call in the National Guard as backup when there are situations that require additional control. I understand that. But I frankly would like to see the United States military begin to transition back to its role of training and organizing and defending our country from foreign adversaries. I hope we can transition back to that role because I think that is a role that is critical to our national security in terms of dealing with foreign terrorism and with foreign adversaries.
Yeah, we're going to get that in a minute. Two follow-ups for you, Secretary Panetta. On this issue, you started talking about from the perspective of 9/11 and the failures that took place on January 6th. Some have advocated for a 9/11-like commission, including Speaker Pelosi has talked about it, others as well. There's been some debate on the composition of that commission. Secretary Panetta, would you support a 9/11-like commission to look into the failures and what happened on January 6th? And then I'd ask afterwards to see if General McMaster and Secretary Esper would support such an approach too. Secretary Panetta.
I think it's important to have a credible commission look at all of the factors that were involved in what happened on January 6th. That's a major event in our history. United States Capitol being attacked and taken over by a mob, and our democracy being challenged. This is a major historical event in the history of the United States, and we better damn well take a very close look at just exactly what happened, how was it inspired, how did it take place, how can we prevent that kind of event from happening. Now, having said that, to have a credible commission, I really do think that it has to be equally balanced between Republicans and Democrats in order for it to be credible. And very frankly, I don't think there should be one chairman. I think there should be two chairmen, one a Democrat and one a Republican of good reputation to be able to handle that kind of very serious commission effort.
Secretary Esper, I see you nodding. It seems like you agree with what Secretary Panetta just said.
Yeah, completely. Look, it was a very important historical event that people will study for decades to come, and not a positive one, right? So I think Leon is absolutely correct. We need to have serious people, independent people take a look at this, just like the 9/11 Commission was. Take their time, do it right, pull it out of politics, pull it out of the moment, and don't get stuck in the TikTok of what happened on this day or that day. We need to really broaden it out and understand what is the root of this. What is the nature of extremism in the country? How is it evolving and changing, and how do we address that? Not necessarily the details of when were the police called or when was the National Guard called, etc. Broaden it out, take the deeper look, because these are important trend lines that we need to understand, and we can't reverse them until we understand them.
I don't want to be blamed if some member of Congress now calls for the Esper Panetta Commission. That was not my intent, but I would say watch out. General McMaster, anything to add to what you heard from Secretaries Esper and Panetta?
No, just to highlight, I mean, I agree completely. Just to highlight the importance of this being bipartisan. I mean, one of the causes of the assault on the Capitol was politicians, the president foremost among them, who are increasingly prone to compromise our principles to score partisan political points. And so I hope that the commission will also maybe define, our political leadership broadly, as part of the problem. And then, of course, those who are also responsible for addressing this problem and restoring our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes.
Secretary Panetta, I want to move to another subject that's gotten a lot of attention also following January 6th, which is extremism within the military. Let me read to you what Secretary Austin said after discussing his own experience with racial intolerance within the ranks of the military. He said, quote, "The job of the Department of Defense is to keep America safe from our enemies, but we can't do that if some of those enemies lie within our own ranks." Give us some perspective. How serious in your mind is the problem of racism and extremism within the military?
I think that my experience with the military is that they are and should be representative of our society in general. And frankly, everyone who wants to serve in uniform in our country ought to be given the opportunity to serve their nation. And I have to tell you that my experience is that the overwhelming majority of members of the military are dedicated, they're patriotic, they're committed to what our country is all about. They are good Americans, they're good citizens, and they're willing to put their lives on the line in order to protect our country. Is there racism? Are there some who are extremists who are part of it? I suspect that is the case, but I do not see it as something that is more overwhelming in the military than in civil society. I think the military, frankly, are a hell of a lot better at dealing with that kind of thing within their ranks. Because, they've got to make sure that the focus in the military is on the military mission. And you cannot accomplish a military mission if you have people who are off on their own toot in terms of racism or extremism or weird conspiracy theories. You've got to get rid of people like that. And so I'm glad to hear Lloyd Austin say that, they're going to take a hard look. But I also believe, very frankly, that the military is an example of an operation where people come together for one purpose, which is to protect and defend the United States of America.
General McMaster, I'm going to go over to you now to change subjects to China and national security strategy. But beforehand, of our guests today, you're the one who most recently was in an Army uniform. Do you have anything to add to what Secretary Panetta just said?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Roger, across my 34 years in the United States Army, I can say with confidence that the culture of our Army and our armed forces is utterly intolerant of bigotry and racism. And that's not to say it doesn't exist within the ranks at all. But what I'm saying is the prevailing culture of our military is to stamp out the behavior associated with bigotry and racism for the reasons that Secretary Panetta cited. The stakes are just too high right? We in our military, we are bound together by an ethos, a warrior ethos that is a covenant that we share with one another, a covenant based on shared principles of honor, respect, and self-sacrifices. Our ethos, it also depends on a covenant that we have with the American people. So I think it's important for the Secretary Austin, who is a great leader, and also I think a great example of our military's ability to overcome bigotry, racism, and so forth as it exists in our society. I'll tell you, Roger, whenever I hear these discussions these days about this as a problem, I want to see the statistics really, and I think that there is a tendency these days to buy into the language of critical race theory and identity politics. And I'll tell you, Roger, that's destructive because it interacts on the other end of the extreme with, white supremacy and bigotry and racism. And I think this is this interaction is the cause of centripetal forces that are pulling us apart from each other and eroding our common identity. I mean, Roger, what's happened in our society these days is you can't even say that we ought to aspire to be colorblind, that we ought to aspire to do what Martin Luther King said we should do, is to not judge people by the color of their skin, but of the content of their character. That is what our military is all about, right? When you're in a firefight, Roger, you're not checking the skin color, or the party registration of the person next to you, right? I mean, you are bound together in a unit that really becomes like a family. And it's been my experience that people come to our military oftentimes with baggage, right? With the burden of bigotry or racism or something. But, I'll tell you, I see that melt away when they are part of this team that's put under challenging conditions and is bound together by a mission bigger than themselves and respect for one another.
And it's been one of the great stories of our military and what makes it the greatest fighting force the world has ever seen. I'm going to not so eloquently pivot to a subject outside of the United States and talk about China and great power competition. We'll start with you, General McMaster, because as your time as national security advisor, you were the lead in drafting a national security strategy of the Trump administration that really focused on China. Secretary Blinken, Secretary of State, on March 3rd said the following, quote, "Our relationship with China will be competitive when it should, be collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. The common denominator is the need to engage China from a position of strength." General McMaster, does this represent a change from the Trump administration approach to China?
No, it's a huge element of continuity. And so I just want to say amen to that. And I think the secretary should receive very high marks, I think, for his initial testimony and the statements he's made since becoming Secretary of State. I think they've been extremely strong and appropriate. And of course, the main point that he's making is really important for Americans to get, right? This is, competition with China doesn't have to lead inexorably towards confrontation, the so-called Thucydides trap. Actually, competition, I believe, is the best way to avoid confrontation, because the approach that we had taken previously of cooperation and engagement and accommodating really the Chinese Communist Party, I think led to a more aggressive stance by the party and put us on a path toward confrontation.
Let me press you on that, because it's another C word that's spooking, let's say, the China hawks, and that is collaboration, looking for those areas of collaboration. I don't recall much collaboration in the previous administration vis-a-vis China. Perhaps a strategy called for it, but it wasn't executed. And I don't say that as a critique. It's just a description, I think, of what happened or did not happen. What are the opportunities of collaboration? Do we have to watch out for that?
Well, I would just sum it up in 5 words: do not fall for it. And it being false promises by the Chinese Communist Party of cooperation in areas that we care about, right? Like climate change and carbon emissions associated with climate change, or denuclearization of North Korea. We just have to remember that we just need to watch what the party does, not what it says. So Xi Jinping, I think it's astounding his ability to portray himself as an environmentalist when China is building scores of coal-fired plants and poisoning the world with carbon emissions. He poses as kind of a free trader when he engages in all forms of economic aggression and a mercantilist approach to trade and economic discourse. He poses as somebody who wants to advance rule of law, which really means the rule of the party, as he imprisons political prisoners, conducts a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, and extends the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong. So I would just say, don't believe anything the party says or promises. It's been promising to adhere to the rules of international commerce since it entered in the World Trade Organization since 2001. And the Europeans just fell for it again with this draft or proposed comprehensive agreement on investment. So, I think I think we ought to cooperate with China whenever we can, where our interests align. But we have to be deeply skeptical.
Skepticism about collaboration. Secretary Esper, I want to go to you. Feel free to comment on what we discussed, but then I also want to get your take on where we are vis-a-vis China as a military in the security realm. But go ahead.
So the good news is, if there's one thing that Republicans and Democrats agree on, it is the challenge that China presents to us. And that's an important thing, that we have that consensus now about the long-term competition, confrontation, if you will, that we see China presenting in the future. HR touched upon a lot of it. Look, China wants to displace us as the world leader, certainly by the year 2049. They want to rewrite the international rules and norms to benefit them. They are using every tool in their kit, whether it's diplomacy, economics, the military, to influence and bully their neighbors and others in the region. So, look, we have to take this on. I think it's great that there is a recognition. I'm encouraged by what the Biden administration, particularly the Secretary Austin, are saying so far. That's good. And on the DoD front, look, I made implementing the National Defense Strategy my top priority and spent a lot of time on it. And we outlined 10 discrete objectives to do that, addressing everything from modernization to doctrinal changes to updating our war plans, you name it. And I think if they could pick that up and put their spin on it, fine tune it, I think we'll be in good shape. But it's going to require also the support from Congress in terms of money and budget. And I know you want to get to that. So look, we have to take this on. This is going to be, China will be the challenge of not just our generation, but of this century. And we have to realize that they have a lot in their favor as well, that will make it challenging. The other important thing we need to do is take advantage of our allies and partners. It is the asymmetric advantage that we have that China and Russia do not have. And so the more we can bring together, certainly the nations of the Indo-Pacific, which I think we've done a lot of good work on, and then also the Europeans. It's critical we got to get the Europeans on board as well, that we can collectively defend our Western values. We can defend this system that we built up in the wake of World War II that has served us all very well for decades now. We need to protect that and strengthen it. And look, it is not inevitable that China will become our enemy. We have time to shape them, to work with them, to try and get them on the right path. But in the meantime, we have to prepare for the worst. And I think that's DoD's job.
One follow-up to that, to you, Secretary Esper, and then we'll go to Secretary Panetta on the same question. Because it relates to the orientation to China, President Biden, and it really was his first speech on foreign policy and national security at a competitor conference, the Munich Security Conference, Ronald Reagan National Defense Forum. He said, quote, "America is back. Diplomacy is back. Allies are back." Almost signaling that diplomacy will be emphasized over the military as a tool to confront our national security challenges. First to you, Secretary Esper, is that the right signal to Beijing specifically? Now, he was speaking to the Munich Security Conference and allies, and that's a very European-esque way to speak. But as far as Beijing is concerned, is it diplomacy first with military behind?
Well, I'd first say that, America never really left the stage. I know I spent a lot of time working with allies and partners on any number of issues, particularly this one. I did 2 meetings with my Indian partners. We had multiple quad sessions. So we never left in terms of engaging our allies and partners. That said, in terms of how you interpret the remarks, I do think we should lead with diplomacy. That is where we want to solve problems through our diplomats, through political agreements. But the way you do that is you have a strong military to buttress that. So if diplomacy fails, the adversary knows that you have the means to address it in other ways and means. So I think too often in government, the military is regarded as the easy button. And so we call upon the military to do this or to do that, things that are often preferably done by other organizations. But look, we need to strengthen the State Department. We need to put more emphasis on diplomacy and lead with that. But at the same time, we can't neglect the military. We have a lot of work to do to modernize and prepare our armed forces for the next several decades. It's going to take money, it's going to take political will, and it's going to take commitment if we're going to be there to support diplomacy.
We're going to come back to you in a second on money, but Secretary Panetta, your take on President Biden's language of America is back, diplomacy is back, allies are back.
Well, I think that is the case. Joe Biden, because of his experience and background, in many ways follows a model of the United States as a world leader going back to World War II. And I think that's what the United States should be all about. I think we are a world leader. And we have to back up that leadership by having a strong military, the strongest on the face of the earth, and a strong diplomacy, having both of those. And I think that's what they have to bring to bear in dealing with our adversaries, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran. We've got to be able to fall back on what constitutes the fundamental strength of the United States, which is our ability to provide world leadership, our values, our belief in what freedom and self-government is all about, but also to recognize that we have to be strong militarily. So in dealing with China, I'm of the view that I think Tony Blinken has the right calibration in terms of being competitive and also being willing to have some collaboration, but also to understand that it has to be adversarial. I think we've got to draw some lines with China. And I think it is very important that we maintain a strong military presence in the Pacific. We had proposed in the Obama administration when I was secretary, rebalancing the Navy to the Pacific. And I still believe in that. I think we do need to have a strong military presence in the Pacific because we are a Pacific power. And because we want to make clear to the Chinese that they can't just simply militarize the islands in the South China Sea. They can't begin to limit our freedom of the seas, and that we are going to stand for open trade and open seas. That's what it's all about, and international law. I think secondly, and Mark mentioned this, we have to build alliances in that part of the world, working with our ASEAN countries, build security alliances. Those countries are advancing economically. We need to bring them together and to work on security in that region because, frankly, that is the best way to be able to then deal with China, is from that position of nations working together in that region. And then lastly, I would go back to trade. I think the worst mistake that was made was walking away from the TTP trade agreement. I think that we had a trade agreement of all of those countries that constituted great competition with China. It's something they understand. I think eventually they probably would have become a part of that. But we've got to go back to showing that we can assert our influence with regards to trade in that region, because that would be a major signal to China. If we develop that kind of strength, if we draw those kinds of lines, then yes, we can have a dialogue with China, but we'll be doing it from strength, not from weakness.
Strength. We're going to pivot now to defense budget, something that I've had an opportunity to work with all three of you on over the years. But I can ask each of you to address it from a different vantage point. Secretary Esper, we'll start with you. The Reagan Institute and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a think tank in DC, well known for its analysis of the defense budget, recently released a report summarizing the findings of a series of defense budget exercises carried out by national security experts. They found that a 10% cut, a measure that's been endorsed by the current Senate Majority Leader, for example, would, quote, call into question America's ability to win a war, let alone deter another. In other words, that America would be more of a regional power, only able to perhaps win one conflict. Your experience, Secretary Esper, You've managed budgets from all sorts of vantage points. Talk to me about this conclusion about a 10% cut, whether you agree and what else you'd say about it.
Sure. First thing, let me just go back a minute to footstop what Secretary Leon Panetta said. I think he brought in the trade piece. To deal with China, we need a whole of government approach. So it is trade, it's USAID, it's commerce, it's energy. We need an entire focus, the entire whole of government on the China challenge. Now, that said, to the budget, look, a 10% cut to DoD would be devastating. That doesn't mean that DoD doesn't get a lot of money every year. It does. It's 3.2% of our GDP. And if you're going to be a world leader, you need at least that much to lead the world, to build the alliances, to conduct the exercises and the training, to have the military. And look, now we're in 5 domains. We're also in space and cyberspace in ways we weren't, even 5 years ago. So 10% would be devastating. I go back to the recommendations of the NDS Commission, the National Defense Strategy Commission. That is, we need 3 to 5% annual real growth. That's not asking for too much, I think, when you look at what we face in the years ahead, and when we look at the defense budget as the share of the broader budget. Look, China is increasing its defense spending, in some cases 10% or more every single year, double digits. Maybe in the last few years, it's been in the high single digits, but they're at a pretty heavy pace, and they have a game plan that they want to modernize their military by 2035 and then have a world-class military, which we interpret as displacing us by the year 2049. We need to update and modernize our military today, and that means we're going to have to make that investment. Now, look, and Secretary Panetta knows better than all of us, we face some really stiff budgetary headwinds. We have our debt, I think, is now $28 trillion. It's the highest it's been as a percent of GDP since World War II. Those numbers continue to grow. We need to fix the fiscal problem facing our country. Maybe go back and look at a formula like we had with the Bowles-Simpson plan of 2010. But we need to get our fiscal house in order, and we need to continue to sustain good levels of defense spending year over year.
Secretary Panetta, I want to follow up with you, pulling a thread that Secretary Esper just noted, and it deals with COVID-19, the pandemic, from the standpoint of dollars spent to address the crisis. Trillions has already been spent by the Congress during the Trump administration. As you're well aware, another $1.9 trillion is going through the Congress as we speak. All of this creates substantial downward pressure on the defense budget. Given your outlook on where you think the top line is going, talk about this. I mean, you've seen this movie before. Actually, I know you've seen it more than once. So, should we expect a declining budget? And then, would you advise against it?
No, look, the budget process is broken, and it's been broken for a number of years. I mean, Democrats and Republicans have both parties have really not wanted to exercise the discipline on the budget that is necessary. And so we basically plodded along these last 15, 20 years on a very hit and miss basis with regards to the budget. There hasn't been any comprehensive budget resolution passed in a long time that identifies priorities for spending. That process is broken down. I mean, the only reason they use that process now is to use reconciliation. Reconciliation was intended for savings in the budget. It wasn't intended to be the train to carry spending proposals. But Republicans have done that. Democrats are now doing that. And so at some point, look, the biggest problem facing the defense budget is budget uncertainty, not knowing what the hell we're going to get. I went through that with a Republican Congress. They were talking about sequester, for goodness sakes, cutting everything across the board. And it just creates chaos because you're not quite sure what you're going to get. So I think it is essential that we return to some degree of certainty. Now, I understand that there are needs now with regards to the situation with COVID. Both Republicans and Democrats have put money into that. I think that's important to try to deal with that pandemic. It's important to get our economy recovered. But at some point, with a $28 trillion debt with a deficit that's probably going to be somewhere between $5 to $7 trillion, it is important to restore budget discipline. We need a budget that looks out 5 to 10 years and makes the decision, how are we going to get on a path to begin to reduce that debt, reduce those deficits, and then define what we're going to spend on defense, what we're going to spend on discretionary, and very frankly, have a better idea what we're going to do with entitlements, which now constitute 2/3 of the federal budget. We need to have that path in order to restore some kind of fiscal discipline to this country.
Sound advice. Unfortunately, not something that political leaders in either party have adhered to over the years. Still, the wisdom is clear there. General McMaster, debt, deficit, defense, declining defense budgets. You have lectured. I've heard you say this so many times. As we develop national security strategies, we have to get into the mindset of the adversary, not what we think the adversary thinks, but what the adversary is actually thinking. How do the Chinese, for example, look at our debt, our deficit, the declining defense budgets that Secretary Esper and Secretary Panetta are responding to? What does this do in terms of our ability to deter these great power adversaries or, rogue states?
Well, I think China thinks it's gaining ground, and I think that's what makes the world more dangerous, is the belief that China's the belief in the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party that, hey, it's time to challenge the United States, because the United States is weakened internally. It doesn't have the ability to have a predictable defense budget to invest in the capabilities that it needs. I mean, the U.S. military, as the secretaries both know well, is still dealing with a bow wave of deferred modernization based on reductions in the defense budget during the Obama years and the legacy of the Budget Control Act and the uncertainty associated with it. So we're already playing catch up. And so I think that China, we have to understand what China and Russia are to a lesser extent are trying to do, is they're trying to create exclusionary areas of primacy in which the U.S. military and the United States broadly, diplomatically, really doesn't have freedom of movement and action. And the only way to really change or shift that what they hope would be denied space into contested space is with really forward positioned, capable joint forces that allow us to continue to deter by denial, which means really convincing a potential enemy that potential enemy cannot accomplish its objectives through the use of force. And so this is why I think it's very important for us to have a predictable budget. The other aspect I would just highlight is it's really, really hard to rebuild a capability once you get rid of it. And the Army, in the midst of the wars we were fighting, was reduced significantly. It is just now rebuilding, and it's done so at great pains. It's hard to keep the numbers of high quality recruits up when you're rebuilding. It's easy to sustain, hard to rebuild. You can't build sergeants overnight. You need those sergeants to have formative experiences as enlisted soldiers and grow that leadership ability. You can't do that overnight. And so I think it's very important as the administration looks at these decisions that they recognize the risk that they take if they do embark on these large reductions. And hey, I'll just say quickly, obviously, generals probably shouldn't talk about about economics, but I will tell you that the point that Secretary Panetta made is really important. We're not going to get at the problem of the national debt and the deficits by going after discretionary spending and defense spending in particular. The problem is in non-discretionary spending, and it could be a revenue issue too. So, but it's not. If you cut defense, what you do is you perpetuate, your debt problem, and you also have a weak defense. So you weaken yourself economically and militarily at the same time.
Yeah. So much more on that. We need to shift to a couple other subjects. Then we're going to open up to questions from our viewers. Let's go to Afghanistan. I'm going to go to Secretary Esper on this because he was pivotal in managing the push to, quote, reduce our presence in Afghanistan, end the forever wars by trying to maintain some level of responsible footprint, my words, to ensure that the threat from Afghanistan is addressed and doesn't threaten the homeland. President Biden and his team is revisiting this, and it's unclear where they're going to land at the around 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, whether they'll keep it at that level or reduce it. What advice do you have for this administration in Afghanistan, Secretary Esper?
Well, look, we went in after 9/11 to make sure that Afghanistan never again became a safe haven for terrorists to attack the United States. And that should be the metric by which we leave. That said, I want to get out of Afghanistan more than anybody else. I mean, the time, the troops, the treasure, everything committed to Afghanistan has been considerable. And when, like I wanted to implement the national defense strategy, you have to look for every way you can to free up the money and the manpower to do what you need to do to confront China in the Asia Pacific or elsewhere. So I thought that the political agreement worked out by the State Department was a credible path forward. It wasn't great. Some might say it wasn't good, but I would say it was good enough. And, it's been a long, bumpy, windy road, but over time, we finally got them talking to one another and sitting down at the table, them being the government in Kabul and the Taliban. But I think the challenge was, and my commitment to that peace plan, if you will, was that it be conditions based. In other words, working with our allies and partners in close consultation and with the government in Kabul, we would reduce our footprint over time based on what we saw the conditions we needed to sustain in order to do those basic functions, conduct counterterrorism, to train and support and assist our Afghan partners and those types of functions. And so I did not think it was prudent at the time and messaged that internally in a classified document that I thought that we should hold at 4,500 because conditions had not been met. The Taliban had not reduced violence. They had not making a clean break from Al-Qaeda, and they weren't taking negotiations seriously at the table. So, and look, at the end of the day, what the Taliban fear the most, or the leverage we had over them at least, was the fact that we had a footprint, we had a presence in Afghanistan, and we had the ability to employ violence against them. And so that was the leverage. I think we need to employ that leverage until the Taliban start living up to their end of the agreement. Thank goodness we have our allies on board there. They now, triple our size in Afghanistan, right, and they're willing to hang in there as long as we are. So it's a tough situation for the Biden administration, but those are my thoughts as I look at it today.
So distilled down, it's the advice of the Biden administration is conditions-based for your decisions here. And it sounds like you didn't want to be at the number we're at. You thought more were required based on what you've just shared. But 2,500, based on what you know, obviously you haven't had the intel briefings recently, is probably where you ought to stay until the conditions allow for further reduction, which you're not seeing just yet.
And look, at the time, the military commanders were comfortable at 4,500. They thought we could do all of our missions with confidence, and I described this. So 4,500 was a number I settled at. Obviously, this administration needs to take their own look at it and decide the way forward, but do so in consultation with allies, which is something I try to do. The other thing you could take a look is, or you walk away, but you do that accepting more risk, and that is a credible path as well. These are the tough issues you have to wrestle with.
You walk away. I think what you're getting at is that you may have to come back, right? And that's always the risk. Let's talk about another area within the Middle East where we always seem to come back to, despite the fact we want to focus on China and Asia more broadly, like Secretary Panetta said. Secretary Panetta, I'm going to talking about Iran here. I want to get your reaction to the following. On February 16th, Secretary Blinken, speaking on the Iranian nuclear program or threat, quote, said, "The path to diplomacy is open right now." February 25th, 9 days later, the U.S. conducts airstrikes against Tehran-backed militias in Syria in response to Iranian-backed rocket attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq. February 28th, Biden administration expresses disappointment after Iran rejects an EU offer to partake in direct negotiations with the U.S. and other JCPOA, that's the Iran deal, signatories. A movie you've seen before, Secretary Panetta, a lot of movies you've seen over these years. Where does this leave us and what's next?
Well, we've seen this movie before with regards to Iran, and we've been playing it for a long time in trying to deal with that regime. Look, I think it's important that we understand that Iran is an adversary in that part of the world, that their goal is to undermine stability in that region, and that they're going to continue to do that. So we have to be prepared to deal with the threat that comes from Iran. I do believe that I think it was the wrong step to walk away from the nuclear agreement. The nuclear agreement wasn't everything that everybody wanted, but in the very least, it was preventing Iran from enriching the fuel to develop a potential nuclear weapon. Walking away from that agreement then gave them an open door to go ahead and proceed with enrichment. I think it's an important step, working with our allies, working with Germany, working with Great Britain, working with France, Russia, China. Those were the allies that came together on the original agreement, trying to get Iran back to the negotiating table and hopefully back within the confines and limits of that agreement. Now, it's not going to be easy. That's not going to be easy. I think it's important to keep that path open. If they want to do it, it's available, and they should make use of that opportunity. But by God, if they don't take advantage of that path, then we're going to continue to put pressure on Iran. We're going to continue to maintain our forces in that region. We're going to continue to respond militarily when they attack our troops. That's the name of the game. You cannot just simply walk away from the threat that Iran represents to that region. So, yes, you need a diplomatic path. If they're smart, they'll take advantage of it. But at the same time, we also have to be prepared militarily to deal with any potential attack from Iran.
I'm going to follow up on that with you, General McMaster. The Biden administration has said that they want to get back into the JCPOA, but they want a better deal. We have only a few minutes left here. Give me your headline. What are you looking for in a better deal if they are going to indeed have a deal with Iran?
Well, I think just fundamentally, a better deal means forcing the Iranian regime to make a choice between either continuing its 4-decade-long proxy war against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, and the Arab monarchies, or behaving like a responsible nation. I mean, the problem with the JCPOA, in addition to the flaws in the agreement itself, in terms of the sunset clause, inadequate verification, not including the missile programs, and so forth, was the fact that it allowed the Iranian leadership to have it both ways, right? To continue the 4-decade-long proxy war and reap the benefits of sanctions alleviation and increased oil exports. And then guess where those profits went? They went to intensifying the war against us and our allies and partners in the region. So I think what is most important is to follow up on what Secretary Blinken said during his testimony, in which he connected, I think, in a very important way, Iran's destructive behavior in the region, the blood that they have on their hands, the humanitarian crisis that they have perpetuated in this sectarian civil war across the Middle East, from Yemen to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. You have to connect that, obviously, to any deal with this regime. And I'll just say finally, quickly, Roger, there are two elements of this, of the nature of the competition with Iran, that we have to keep foremost in our minds. First of all, the ideology of the revolution. The people who are in charge are the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Zarif and Rouhani, who's about to get voted out of office, they are the shop window of that regime. They don't represent that ideology, and they are part of our self-delusion in connection with Iran. And the second is associated with that, is that this regime, as of now, is permanently hostile to us, right? And so I think we have to recognize the realities, and that's really the first step in being able to make any kind of diplomatic or other progress in connection with Iran.
So in some ways, it's not just what are the elements of the deal, but who are you making the deal with? If I understand what you're talking about, not the people in the storefront, but actually people running the show. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to switch to one more subject. Tony Capaccio, one of the long veteran reporters for Bloomberg at the Pentagon, was asking about the legacy of the Trump administration, particularly with civilian control of the military. I want to piggyback on that and ask specifically about the following. We've now had two secretaries of defense who began their appointment as Secretary within 7 years of leaving their military career and required a waiver. We had that now with Secretary Austin, and we had it with Secretary Mattis. Secretary Panetta has the exception now become the rule. That is to say that the rule that you should not have a person leaving the military within 7 years become Secretary of Defense now become something that's fine.
Yeah, I'm not sure this waiver makes a lot of sense these days, to be truthful. If you're going to have a requirement, you either stick to the requirement or you don't have the requirement. And look, I understand the reason for the exception for Lloyd Austin. I understand the reason for the exception for Jim Mattis. They're both good people. They're both qualified, and they both, really were very qualified secretaries of defense. So I understand why, and I don't think having given a waiver to Jim Mattis that when it comes to the first black secretary of the Defense Department, that somehow you draw the line and say we're not going to provide a waiver for Lloyd Austin. So I do think that Congress has to give serious consideration to if they're going to have a requirement, there ought not to be a waiver, or they ought to get rid of the requirement. One of the two.
Secretary Esper, should we get rid of the law? So I get it, we shouldn't do a waiver. So we just get rid of the law and not prohibit former retired general officers, flag officers from becoming Secretary of Defense.
This law was put in effect decades ago and was honored for many decades as well. I had the privilege of sharing the same hometown as George Marshall, right? The first person to get the waiver. And George Marshall himself, if I read him correctly, also didn't think that retired general officers should become defense secretaries. So that's kind of where I come down on the issue. It's irrespective of the person or their qualifications. But look, Leon's right. If you're going to have a requirement, then honor it. And we did for decades, and don't allow for a waiver. Now, one would argue that Marshall's conditions were exceptional because we had just begun the Korean War and had suffered a serious loss in the opening battles. But even then, if you're going to have a requirement, understand why you're doing it, and then live up to it, and don't grant waivers. And that's the key to approach it. That said, this term about civilian control of the military gets bannered around a lot these days. We need to really sharpen our language on this. I don't have any concern whatsoever about the civilians not being in control of the military. Everybody at DoD recognizes this, particularly the military. It's ground into the culture, into the ethos, into their oath, if you will. The challenge we have to deal with, and it's one I faced and started pulling back, was the relationship between the civilians at DoD. And really, this is really a Pentagon issue, right? The relationship between the civilians at Pentagon, OSD staff and civilian secretaries, and the military. In this case, it's the geographic combatant commanders who exercise, I think, an inordinate amount of influence. And that's what I was working to kind of bring back and put the civilians back into the processes, put them back in charge of these functions, regain control of the budget, internal. Those are the things that we need to look at.
Interesting, yeah, and that's something the National Defense Strategy Commission really emphasized, just that, balancing it out. General McMaster, you get the last word here as we have to wrap up. Taking this issue of civilian control of the military, the exceptions to the rule that we've just discussed, kind of keeping your old military uniform on, is this good or bad for the military to have two recently former general officers serve as Secretary of Defense?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to worry about in the world, Roger, and I don't think this is one of the things to worry about. And I think that what's really important is to recognize that, no two military officers are the same, right? I mean, in terms of your background, your experiences, even your character. So I think we would do well to evaluate, candidates for Secretary of Defense by their background, experience, and their character. And in all of those areas, Lloyd Austin, I think, is off the charts in terms of the person you want, right? He commanded complex operations abroad that demanded the integration of all elements of national power, not just the use of the military instrument. As Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, he knows all of the problems that we have in defense acquisition and how difficult it is to innovate within the cycle of technology to remain competitive. And he is a man of an extraordinary character who, in all of my interactions with him, never saw anything motivating him other than a desire to serve his country, and the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in his command. So, because Robert McNamara didn't have a great record as Secretary of Defense. So, should we put in really the requirement for a waiver for automobile executives, to have the position? So, I think you just have to evaluate the individual.
Fair enough. Bottom line, would you then strike this law?
Yeah, I don't think it, as Secretary said, it may not have utility, except maybe to encourage a broad range of experiences and perspectives to be brought to the department. And so I think that that range of experience that you need and the qualities of leadership for that massive undertaking, because big parts of our military do resemble a big corporation. I think that diversity in your pool is important. Right. So I would not say, we want this as the rule now, for retired generals to be secretaries of defense. Maybe still we do want it to be the exception, but so I think but it doesn't make sense, because I think the Senate has the opportunity to vote for or against an individual nominee with or without this waiver. Gentlemen,
Thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to leave it there. I look forward to welcoming you back in person in December of 2021 in Simi Valley, California at the Reagan National Defense Forum. We need to keep Secretary Esper's streak going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Take care, everybody. Great to see you.
Great. Good to be with all of you.
Good to see you,
Thank you.
Secretary.
Likewise.
Secretary.
See ya. See you, HR.
Bye.